Jonny Steinberg, sitting comfortably in Oxford, I'm told. Welcome to our podcast series, Help Us Understand. Briefly, 2 points by way of introduction. First, this series is presented by the Gordon Institute of Business Science, more particularly the Anti-Corruption Coalition Project, located in the Centre for Business Ethics here in Johannesburg. Second, the series is presented in order to promote an objective analysis and understanding of serious issues facing our country, related primarily to the incident of corruption in South Africa. But before we get there, tell us a little about yourself for those persons who will hopefully watch this podcast but might not have direct knowledge of you. Your background, academic journalism, Yale, Oxford, and your best book.
Hi, Paul. Very, very good to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. So I teach at Yale University for 4 months of the year, and the rest of the year I write full time. And that's largely how I've lived my life, university teaching and writing about contemporary South Africa and the recent South African past. I've been doing that for nearly a quarter of a century now. My best book, I think that the author is the last person to ask what their best book is, but and I don't know. I always like to think that the best book is my last book, which was a double biography of Winnie and Nelson Mandela, which was using their marriage as a vehicle to try and understand a century of South African history from his birth in 1918 to her death in 2018, and try and use those two very larger-than-life figures to tell a broad sweep story.
And you have, as a result, won several awards. People can read all about it on your bio on the net, but you have received 3 Alan Paton Awards, I believe.
I'm very, very humble to have received them.
Well, let's get on then to today's topic. We are, and the statement has been repeated many times in the last year or so, 30 or more years into our constitutional democracy. Yet we live in a society with an economy deep in ever-increasing corruption and criminality. And I think few political commentators and indeed few inhabitants of the country will dispute that. Secondly, and more specifically for today, our security apparatus is in crisis. I wanted to call it a security network. However, that donates some cohesion, and I don't think that is a fair observation. We've got corruption, which is endemic and worsening. We have political interference. We have factionalism. We have a lack of effectiveness, importantly, in curbing corruption and criminality, and importantly, a lack of accountability within our constitutional framework. Your writing posits that this reflects a central phenomenon in our body politic, and that is the lack of separation between our party political leadership on the one hand and our law enforcement entities, particularly the South African Police Service, on the other. Can you go back in history a little, please, and talk about the origins of this phenomenon and how it is prevalent still today?
Well, I'm glad that you started there and framed things exactly like that, because I think that on this matter, on many matters, but on this matter in particular, going back into history is really important. And for me, the starting point is to note that there has not been a proper separation of policing and the ruling party in South Africa's modern history. And I think it's very important to go deep into time and look at this. So, I mean, just as a broad, crude sketch, under apartheid, the structure of the police, there were 3 branches of the police. uniformed detective and security police. And the real bottom feeders, the bottom tier, the people with the least respect and gravitas in the organization with the uniform branch. In the middle was the detective service, also not a particular gatherer of esteem in the organization. The elite of the organization was the security branch, and they ran the organization. The national commissioners and the deputy commissioners usually were chosen from their ranks. And they were pretty much party political appointments. They believed in the National Party's project. They were very often National Party members. And the reasons were obvious. The main function of the police was to fight an internal and external enemy. But the boundary between protecting a regime and protecting a ruling party was completely blurred. And so you essentially had a police force that was pretty much beholden to the project of a party. In 1994, I would say between 1994 and 2000, there was a hiatus, a pause, a kind of a holding period where the ANC did not at all trust the police that they had inherited. In that time, they dismantled the security branch. They did as much as they possibly could to disempower police intelligence. They scattered old intelligence and security branch people across the police service to try and dissolve any concentration of them. They elevated uniformed police. But it was a 6-year hiatus when they were pausing and beginning to take control of the police themselves. And I think that the year 2000 was the crucial year in the history of modern South African policing, where the ANC did take control under Thabo Mbeki and had the opportunity for the first time to build in that separation between ruling party and police. It was a pivotal moment in the history of policing. Thabo Mbeki chose not to do that, which I think was a fateful decision. I don't know how much you want me to go into that now, but I think that's a huge moment.
What was the incentive to decide on that structure between law enforcement on the one hand and the state on the other? Why did that happen?
Well, very, very obviously, very different motives to the apartheid order, which was, wanted the police close because they were fighting an internal enemy. Thabo Mbeki wanted the police close in order to manage his own party. That was essentially his chief motivation. He wanted to be the one to decide who and who not in the ruling elite, and particularly in the ruling party, was going to be investigated. For him, that was an enormous source of power in controlling the party. The ANC was an enormously broad church, quite a raucous organization. Much of Black South Africa was encompassed under one umbrella. Very, very different social classes, political tendencies. He was well aware of what a hard party it was to manage. And so what he did was put his own client into the role of police commissioner, Jackie Selebi, the first Black police commissioner in South African history, the first person appointed, directly by the ANC. He was really an Mbeki henchman, with no experience of policing, with little respect among police officers. And at the time, Paul, I was interviewing a range of senior police officers who had been there, for many years and watched Selebi come in, and they were really horrified from the beginning by what he was doing. He would call senior people into his office and say, "I want X investigated." And they would say, "Well, for what? What happened?" He said, "I don't care. I want that person to go down." And that person was always an ANC aligned person. That was somebody in the new establishment who was causing trouble. And this was happening outside of line functions, outside of bureaucratic institutions and control. He immediately set up this incredibly crudely personalized system with quite naked party political motivations. And that was from 2000.
That's pretty frightening, and perhaps not sufficiently investigated and publicized as we have the good fortune to have now. Jonny, what was the outcome of this approach to the structure of the state and the relationship between the ruling party as it was then and the law enforcement establishment? What was the outcome?
Well, if Mbeki had been thinking long term, if he'd be thinking, what is this institution going to look like after I'm gone? What am I establishing for the next generation and the generation after? He would have built a Chinese wall between the police and the ruling party. He would have understood that over the long term, that is for the better for the country. And within a few years, he had been thrown out and Jacob Zuma was in. History had moved on, but the structure that Mbeki put in place remained. And really, the SAPS was a thoroughly weakened organization by the time Zuma took over. And Zuma did to the SAPS what Mbeki had. He made it his own. But unlike Mbeki, he was not interested in building a technocratic state. He was not interested in economic growth. As we famously all know, his project was a kleptocratic one, to steal from the state. And what he needed from the police was not to investigate him and not to investigate the entire project around him. The organization as a whole, the ANC, fractured into different zones and cliques of corruption, and the police began tracing what was happening in the ruling party. As the ruling party became splintered into different factions, different criminal factions, so did the police. But my point is that may not have happened, or the police at least may have been better protected from what Zuma did if his predecessor had built a stronger organization. And we have the counterfactual in the form of SARS, which Mbeki did take very seriously as a thoroughly technocratic, bureaucratic, independent institution. And the result is that although Zuma did rip SARS to pieces, it also recovered because it had the institutional memory and it had the ethos. And if the police had been treated the way SARS was treated, the police probably also would have recovered from Zuma. But instead, it entered the Zuma epoch in an extremely weakened form and has never really recovered to what Zuma did to it.
Yes, the difference between and historically viewed SARS on the one hand and the South African Police Service on the other is in fact striking. It could have been different. So as I understand your thesis, Jonny, the crisis in law enforcement that we see today is nothing new to our country. It has its roots, historical roots, firmly within the way the law enforcement entities have been managed in relation to the ruling party of the time.
Well, I think the crisis is new. But I think to understand the crisis, one needs to go back into history and to see what some of the implications are when you have decade upon decade upon decade of no line between ruling party and police. And what happens when there's, really before 2000, there probably realistically wasn't an opportunity to have an independent police service, realistically. In Mbeki's time, there actually was, for the first time, a real window of opportunity to build something different. And that's why I want the whole history to come in, just to show how unique that second ANC administration was, how it had the space, the room for creativity, for imagination, that the very structure of South African history had not presented to anybody before, and the consequences of that opportunity being missed.
The Scorpions might have been an exception, but of course they saw their demise quite early.
Yes, they did, but again, I don't want to monomaniacally bash Mbeki, but by the time his administration was over, it was so clear that he would not allow an independent police commissioner, and he would not allow an independent public prosecutor. Very, very important for the future of the Scorpions. When Vusi Pikoli tried to act independently and go after Celebi, he was fired, and the Scorpions were tainted by that. They were painted with the same brush. They came out of an Mbeki era where, you had a president who was quite nakedly using law enforcement and investigation and prosecution for his purposes. And so the Scorpions too were unprotected because of the history of what had happened over the preceding 9-10 years.
Johnny, let's fast forward to what's been termed colloquially as the Mkhwanazi moment, and the way that his announcement in KwaZulu-Natal was made and portrayed, surrounded by military uniforms and the like. What did you make of that? What was happening there?
Well, I think the start of that story is Cyril Ramaphosa finally attempting a real project to reform the police. He had backed off throughout all 5 years of his first term. He was essentially too afraid. I think he understood how deep the problem was. He wasn't confident that if he tried to reform, he could control what he was letting loose. He delayed and delayed until there was an enormous amount of pressure at him at the beginning of his second administration to do something serious. And the serious thing he did is that he took his own chosen successor as president, his own preferred candidate for president of the ANC and of South Africa, Senzo Mchunu, and sent him into the police with the mandate to fix it up with full presidential backing. And that was really going to be Mchunu's dress rehearsal to lead the country. That was the plan, that he was prove his mettle in the most difficult portfolio of all. And, well, you, Paul, know literally better than anybody else in the country what happened next. But one of the things that happened is that this highly corrupt police force, which was now entwined in organized crime in so many different ways, rebelled against the ostensible reformer, the person sent in by the president to change it. And I think that the Mkhwanazi moment is the most explosive of those moments, but that's where it is best placed. It's an organization which had not really been controlled or properly monitored, finally facing a very imperfect agent coming in to try and reform it, and this was its response. And Mkhwanazi's response was outsized. It was, he appeared in a visually very powerful way. The economy of the vigil is incredibly effective. Surrounded by men with AK-47s, him dressed in military fatigues, saying, "I'm ready to fight you." And it was a devastating moment for me because who was he ready to fight? He was ready to fight a cabinet minister and a president, wearing military fatigues, surrounded by armed men.
So he wasn't inside the establishment, he was outside the establishment.
Well, he was both in and out, as the most skillful populists are. He was a high-ranking police officer, but he was speaking as a populist does from, allegedly from outside of the system.
What is the response? The public response was enormous, vocal and widespread. What does that say about the trust of the general population in the institutions that make up our law enforcement network?
I was surprised by the response because, South Africans have for a long time been very skeptical of populists, very skeptical of people claiming to speak on their behalf. Julius Malema caused great excitement in the mid and late noughties. His shelf life was actually quite brief. He now runs a party with substantial support, but it has a very low ceiling. People are enormously skeptical of what he says. I always understood South African public culture to be deeply skeptical, that those who stand up and say they have authority are immediately questioned. And for me, Mkhwanazi was a break from that. It was something new. And that itself is a symptom of a society which is very tired of a generation of systemic corruption.
You will go on to say, when we refer to a few of your articles, that the situation is much more complex than a good cop, bad cop dichotomy. what is happening in our body politic
Mm.
as reflected in our law enforcement. Again, I use network advisedly. It's hardly cohesive. And importantly, may I just mention this, Johnny? We are at a space in our history where the edifice of power is declining, and the ruling governing party is weakening. I'm not sure that a weak ANC is a good thing for the country, even though it may be necessary to go through a period of transformation and development. Um, and we are entering a sphere of political contestation, serious political contestation. The factionalism that we see, including within the South African Police Service, does this have any relationship to a future effort to maintain or obtain power, influence, control?
Well, what's happened is the fairly thorough and deep criminalization of a security service. Um, and once that happens, the politics of the security service become very fluid and very situational. What a security apparatus that is deeply corrupted does depends on how it's reading a moment in time, who the political forces are, and who's going to stop them and who isn't. And so the big question becomes who is capable of police reform, and what sort of momentum does police reform have behind it? I would say that the window of opportunity for Ramaphosa is fast closing. Um, it's police reform in South Africa is an immensely difficult task, which is precisely why Ramaphosa, who I think genuinely wanted to do it, left it very, very late. And I think it is too late for him because I think it requires a police minister who's not an acting police minister, as Kachalia is. The very word acting means the organization just needs to wait because he's transitory.
It described it in one of your articles as Plan B. The
Well, Plan A
phrase,
was Nkunu, which exploded in Ramaphosa's face almost as soon as it hit the ground. Plan B is an acting police commissioner and an acting police minister. And this is a very, very old, powerful organization which can wait out acting people. Um, I, you know, it's a very difficult task. It requires a strong, charismatic, very savvy, very hard police minister coming in who is seen by the organization to be fully backed by his president. And only once that happens will the good people in the organization have sufficient courage to stand up and try and help that reforming minister with his or her project. If the good people in the organization sense that the minister is weak, that the minister does not have the president's backing, that the minister is temporary, that the president himself will be out in a couple of years, they don't have the courage to stand up and back that new reform project. Which is why I think that the window is possibly closed for the Ramaphosa era. And a great deal depends on what happens next, on who the next president of the ANC is, for a start, and on how the vote lines up in 2029 and what sort of government we have from 2029. I think that the future of the police hinges on those two questions, that not a great deal more is going to change under Ramaphosa, as far as I can see. I don't think that makes the Madlanga Commission irrelevant at all. I think that it's what it has exposed is out there. The recommendations have legs, are there as instruments for a new administration that wants to do something. So I think the commission itself could end up being consequential over time. But I think that we're looking at a fairly long timeline now. But it is going to take something special in the next administration. It's going to take an administration, that really, really wants to reform the police, and we can come to why an administration might not want to, but also has the skill and the tenacity and the bloody mindedness to reform the police. It's among the most difficult tasks that a new administration is going to have.
you, in your statement now, you raised the next question. Why might it not be in the interests of the next administration to reform with the strength of leadership that you've just described?
There are a range of reasons, but I think that the most important one is that a properly independent police, and most important, a properly independent investigation and prosecution service is really going to mess with the ruling party in ways that a president is not going to be able to control. And any president, even if they themselves are very clean, and even if a part of them really, really wants a reformed and clean security apparatus, also has to manage a party. And when your party is systemically corrupt, which inevitably means that allies of yours are corrupt, people who you need as partners and permanent allies are in danger of investigation, you worry a great deal about what an investigative service, which is not in your control, is going to do.
Yes, you've highlighted the need for strong political will, but a surrender of protectionism.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that I don't know if that political will can come from the ANC now, just because of the structure of the situation in which it finds itself. That you can have a president with enormous will, but is nonetheless constrained by the nature of the organization, because he also has a will to manage his organization. And I think that we've reached the point where managing a party and having a genuinely independent investigative and prosecutorial function are very hard to juggle at the same time.
Yes, you raise an interesting point, because that was exactly the point that our president made when he gave evidence before the Zondo Commission, that he knew state capture was happening, but he couldn't activate opposition to it because he would have lost power entirely and been unable to institute the reforms that ultimately he attempted to do. But you raise another point, which goes to the structure of our constitution and the various supervisory bodies that exist. We have the Independent Police Directorate, we have the State Security Agency, we have parliamentary committees, the Joint Standing Committee on Intelligence, which comprises all the political parties that have sufficient representation in Parliament. We have cabinet committees. Why were they unable to detect what was going on before Madlunga even was on the scene, and let alone put a stop to it? It seems, I'm trying to find the correct word, which is a polite word, but it seems extraordinary that all these bodies, with their budgets, with their makeup, including opposition parties, were unable to discover what was manifestly obvious to some. No recognition, no sufficient recognition, and no visible response. What was going on here?
Well, this is not a question confined to the police. You know, state capture happened under the nose of Parliament, under the nose of various independent, ostensibly independent agencies. And it took, in the first instance, the media to begin the expose. Part of it is a legacy which evolved very quickly after apartheid of a very, very weak Parliament. And that itself is partly a function of one party getting large majority again and again and again. It learns to bully Parliament. It learns to get its way in committees. And by the time state capture happened, that was a very, very powerful legacy. This is almost now ancient history, but I remember, Andrew Feinstein, back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, resigning as the head of one of Parliament's most important committees as an ANC MP because the executive wouldn't let him do his job. So this is what happens when one party gets voted in again and again and again. It has the weight and learns skills to squash Parliament, to control it. And that's been the story of 30 years.
Johnny, you wrote a very clear and insightful, I thought, article entitled How SAPS Were Licensed to Steal, an opinion piece that appeared recently. And in it, you spoke of an analogous situation that might occur in a large retail organization. And you referred to research done by an associate of yours. And you described how a business would survive and how the political establishment, has nevertheless, and notwithstanding what is happening, perpetuated itself. Tell us about that analogy, because I believe it illustrates a number of points very, very clearly and in a way that is accessible to ordinary mortals like myself.
Well, Paul, what triggered that column was just reading the newspaper one morning and seeing a police officer who had been caught in the act of armed robbery. And he was literally lying down on the tarmac with his hands cuffed behind his back. And a journalist came up to him and said, "Why did you do it?" And he said, "I was trying to make ends meet." And that just triggered an old memory. I mean, this is really more than 15 years old. A colleague of mine was in a really unique position of doing a survey among the employees of a large department store chain in South Africa, and managed to do the survey under conditions where the respondents were ensured of complete anonymity and could ask really difficult questions like, if you were given the chance, would you regularly steal from your employer? And 3/4 of the people said yes, if we were going to get away with it, we would do that. And the next question was, why? Is it not wrong? And the answer was, no, it's not wrong. We are struggling, and this corporation is wealthy. There is no moral issue. And in a way, that's unsurprising in a country like South Africa, where the circumstances of your birth, more than in most countries in the world, determine your circumstances at your death. We have 3/4 of the country 3/4 of kids will not learn to read and write properly because of the families they were born into. And in that situation, why not take from wealthier people? We also have, an emerging middle class, which is finding getting to the middle class incredibly, incredibly hard. It means going into a lifetime of debt. It means trying to shrug off the extended family members who are left behind and who are pulling you back down. Being an emergent middle-class member in South Africa feels deeply unfair. So I think that it's entirely unsurprising that a bunch of ordinary South Africans working for a big corporation would say that in a questionnaire. But of course, most of them don't steal because department stores have mechanisms to ensure that they don't. And if they didn't have those mechanisms, then everybody would steal and the department store would close down and not pay them a wage anymore. And I think what's happened in the police, I think that police officers are very similar to the people who work in those department stores. Police officers are usually the first generation of a new middle class. They're the first people in their families' histories to earn a reasonably decent income, to have a job which is secure for life, a pension. They move into the suburbs, they buy a home on mortgage, they buy a car, they're trying to get their kids into a fee-paying school. They are absolutely drowning in debt. And I know that from spending time with them on patrol. That's all they speak about. But the difference is that they are in an organization where from 2000, the mechanisms that any department store would have to stop theft are gone. Jackie Celebi closed down his anti-corruption units immediately. Senior police officers began stealing themselves as a theater for lower officers. And so I think what you have is, I think it's very important to understand that police officers are ordinary South Africans, and that because of the incredibly difficult country South Africa is, a lot of ordinary South Africans have no problem stealing from people who are richer for completely understandable reasons. But the police, you have an institution of 150,000 people or more in which the controls are all gone, and this institution is everywhere. It's in every village and every town across the country. It's absolutely huge. Because of the nature of the work, you have people dealing with criminals every day. And that is just a recipe for deep systemic, wide-scale corruption, and a recipe for the sort of corruption that comes with a lot of violence. Because excuse me, I mean, members of the police at the department store are dealing with you and me. Police officers are dealing with very violent people. And so it really is a cocktail for tremendous trouble.
You then go on to make what I think is an essential point in understanding the current situation in law enforcement. You say that a business such as the one you have been talking about, if it didn't have internal controls, it would go out of business. And you then say quite clearly that the South African establishment doesn't go, quote, out of business, unquote, because it's perpetually financed. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, as you've just said, any business that requires, that lives off its turnover and its profit must stop theft, because if it didn't, it would go out of business. The police force is absolutely massive, and it has a constitutional imperative to survive. It is perpetually funded by tax-paying money, and yet there are no controls on its members thieving. And the result is that, I mean, bizarrely, ironically, the institution which is designed, whose purpose is to enforce law, is the perfect breeding ground for perpetual unchained lawlessness, funded by taxpayers. It's an extremely ironic situation.
You wrote, Johnny, another article that is equally straightforward and incisive. You entitled it "The Umbilical Cord Between Police and Party Must Be Cut," looking forward towards constitutional and organizational solutions. I presume you retain the view that you've expressed historically, that umbilical cord between party and police must be cut. How would this reflect in our institutions? In practice, what would need to happen?
I think that a lot of what would happen would be at the level of the almost indefinable texture of an organizational culture. I'm not sure how much of it would be expressed in a change of rules, certainly not in any constitutional amendment. And that's the difficulty of it. We're seeing in American society right now how much of the way a society works does not depend on its rules, but on its informal modes of conduct established over time. And that makes things very hard, because we have a police force which in a very short period of time has developed informal rules of conduct which are horrendous. And re-establishing them requires that story that I told a little earlier of a very, very strong president, a very, very strong police minister, showing the organization showing the good people in the organization that they can be brave, that they can stand up. And really, that is the beginning and the end of it. It's very, very hard. It's not about legal reform. It's not about regulatory reform, I don't think. That's the tough part.
Yes, you raised an issue that I'm entirely curious to discover what you think about. But I'll come to that at the end, and that is what's happening in the world today and how we can survive notwithstanding, or whether we are remote from it. But before we get there, in your article, under the rubric of the future, what we can do in the future, and you've mentioned this already, and I think there's a quote from your article that captures it entirely. You say, Ramaphosa is an underpraised president. He was given a gigantic task and he got it right, or a lot of it right. But this one was too big for him. The story of the police and the future is now on pause. The next chapter will only really begin in earnest with a new generation of political leadership. Who that leadership is will matter a great deal. If they are weak or disinterested, this dispiriting story will go on and on. That's a fair summary of your view.
Sure.
It does require a degree of institutional independence. You have also stated that over and above the leadership issue. But let me cheat a little, Johnny, and ask you a question, which I think our viewers will be interested in, and which is very topical, and which I have given you no warning. I apologize, it's unfair, but that's the name of the game. What's happening in the world today is concerning. Are we isolated from it? Are we affected by it? What is the relationship between the uncertainty, and that's a very polite word, that we experience in the world today, particularly at the hands of the US, and others, of course. I'm not excluding other playmakers. How does it relate to us? Can we isolate ourselves from it?
Wow, Paul, that is not just an unexpected question, but an absolutely gigantic question. We could have a whole podcast on that. But no, no, no. Let me nibble at it. Once again, I think it's worth going back into history. Where are we? We're in 2026. 100 years ago, 90 years ago, 80, 70 years ago, more than half of the gold sitting in central bank reserves across the world was mined in South Africa. The country had an outsized strategic importance, and that gave it enormous leverage. And so, for instance, in March 1960, the Sharpeville massacre happened, and America pretty much came to South Africa's rescue, apartheid South Africa's rescue in a time of trouble. It encouraged massive inward investment from American companies. It got the World Bank to loan South Africa a great deal of money at very little interest rates. It didn't do that, out of white solidarity alone. It did so because South Africa was strategically very, very important. And I think that what democratic South Africa has struggled to comprehend is that we're not nearly important as we were. Just because that's the way the dice have rolled. We don't have the strategic leverage we once did. And I think that the model of the US-British relationship with the apartheid state remains stuck in people's minds. And South Africa's current foreign policy establishment believes that we can have allies like that again. This time they might be Russia or China, not the US, but that it's possible to model an unconditional, unbreakable friendship with a large power that South Africa enjoyed in the 1950s, 1960s, and that is gone, and it's gone because we will never have that strategic leverage again. We don't matter enough anymore, and it's very, very important to get into that mindset. It's important to understand that as a small player, you need to be wily, a little cynical, very, very flexible. You also need a foreign policy establishment with the intellectual heft to get there, to play that nimble game. So the direct answer after that long preamble, the direct answer to your question is no, we absolutely can't be isolated from what's happening in the world. But in order to navigate this world, we need to understand who we are. We need to have the self-reflection, the humility, the intelligence to understand what role we play in this world.
That's food for thought. Thank you, Johnny. Well, perhaps we'll read about it sometime in your columns. Just finally, the media, as we know in South Africa, and historically it's quite interesting to understand how it plays such an important role in our body politic, in our society, informing views. It's arguably indispensable part of our continued progress as a society. You are very vocal in your writing, and there are, of course, many others. Open any newspaper, whether online or in hard copy today, and there is a plethora of informed, very strong comment. What I want to ask you is anyone listening do you get the sense that people are hearing you, or are there other factors which are too powerful to see the common sense that you write about?
Um, Paul, I don't know that somebody like me is particularly important. I don't know. I don't think that columnists are the ones in the media who move the world. But I do think that South African journalistic investigators have done an enormous amount. I mean, they've been key players in the last 30 years. They really, really have been. Um, they're just a handful of people. They work on a shoestring, and yet they're very vulnerable, and yet they've been major, major players at various moments in recent South African history, most dramatically during state capture, but at various other moments during the arms deal, way back in the Mbeki era. Um, so, yeah, I, I think that columnists like me we're speaking to a relatively small audience when you think of the whole of South Africa and all its diversity. We're often speaking to people who are reading us because they like to hear what we say, and it's a little bit of an echo chamber. Maybe we make a few people think new thoughts. But if you look at what really, really matters, what changes the trajectory of the country, what changes the course of the country, those people doing investigation are playing an outsized role, much, much more than any role that I'll ever play as economist.
In fact, investigative media highlight the deficiencies in our own investigative system in South Africa, and that's been illustrated time and time again. But I wouldn't underestimate the opinion makers that you and your colleagues. But I'm not entitled to express personal views on this podcast. These are your views, not GIBS's views.
On that question, I think that very, very, a tiny proportion of South Africans reads newspapers, or certainly reads the sort of newspapers where a columnist like I will write. And I think it's a failing of South African newspapers in general that we don't recognize what a small proportion of the population we are, and how we tend to write as if we and our readership are South Africa, when in fact the vast majority of South Africans don't think the way we think, are not reading what we write, and yet are massively important to where the country is going. Having really, really lauded and heralded investigative journalists, I do think that, and I'm as guilty as this of anybody, I mean, perhaps more than most, I think that we are insular, and that the South African media finds it very, very hard to grasp the breadth of the country and try and not just represent voices, beyond the usual ones, but to try and actually comprehend the breadth of the country in the way that we write about it, in the world that we create when we write. I think that's quite a big limitation of the South African media. And Paul, I see that whenever I go out into the country and talk to ordinary people who do not read the newspapers that I read, their understanding of the country is dramatically different to mine. And if I can give you a small example, a couple of months ago, I was in some towns in the old Transkei, and I was talking to people about COVID. And in one town after another, people said to me that nobody around here was vaccinated. And the reason is that a story was spreading that the vaccines were designed to kill people, and that Cyril Ramaphosa had negotiated the entrance of the vaccines to South Africa because the South African population had become too large to govern, and he wanted to make it smaller. And I was astonished by how many people told me the story, how many people believed the story, from wise old men and women to young people. I wouldn't say it was completely ubiquitous, but it was out there. It was one of these stories of the pandemic. You could read South African newspapers until you're blue in the face, until your eyes won't read anymore. You won't know that.
Yes, those stories need to be told. I thought the other day, and thinking of podcast series, where is our Charles Dickens? We don't have those storytellers telling
Yeah,
about what's
yeah.
happening amongst our marginalized community, or perhaps not marginalized, main communities. Um, Jonny, just before we close off, what you say about mainstream media, and as part of that mainstream media, the investigative media, um, fair comment, but the larger portion of the populace is exposed and does appear to be engaged in social media. Is that a good, bad thing, or both good and bad?
Well, I was saying earlier how surprised I was by the country's very naive response to Mkonazi's press conference, and I think that press conference was a very good example of a social media phenomenon, that the story would not have meant what it did, wouldn't have gathered speed and power the way it did in a pre-social media age. Really, the great power of social media is twofold. I mean, the one is that it works through the power of very, very brief images. TikTok, for instance, either grabs somebody's attention within 3 seconds or they flip over to the next story. And so it's about the immediate power of the visual. And the other thing about social media is that it's intertextual. It's about what else is happening on social media. And so at the time of Mkonazi's press conference, the person trending most often on African TikTok was Captain Ibrahim Traore, the leader of Burkina Faso, who had come to power in a coup 2 years earlier. And he was a man in military fatigues, surrounded by men with AK-47s. And what he represented across social media, across Africa, was an ordinary young man, a mere captain who only earned his salary, who took on a powerful and corrupt establishment and overthrew them and instituted a clean regime. And obviously that's not his real story, but that's his social media story. And he became iconic. I'd earlier just visited Nairobi, and people in the streets, the taxi drivers, the people, the vendors in the streets were talking about him and looking at them on their phones. And Konazi was a model of that. He was the South African Traore. He was the man in the camouflage, surrounded by people with automatic weapons. He was the clean captain taking on the establishment. So I think that these very, very visually fast, quite simplistic memes move at lightning speed. And I don't think that Mkonazi would have got the traction that he did in another age, in the 5-10 years before. So I think it's a very powerful new medium.
Yes. Jonny, you were kind enough to accept our invitation to talk on this platform. Thank you very much for that. But I'm not going to let you go without asking one more very unfair question. Do you have hope?
I do have hope. I think that South Africa is a massively difficult country and could only ever have been a massively difficult country. There was never any other possibility. And a great deal has gone wrong. A great deal has happened to make one very sad. But at the same time, South Africa is actually miles away from real instability. Think that under Ramaphosa we've seen some glimmers of how the country might be governed well. And, depending on what happens in the next elections, things could get a lot better. I think as South Africans that it is very, very important to, and very, very difficult to embrace the fact that the future really is uncertain. It's a vulnerable country. Things could go much better than they are now. Things could not. Partly, it's a bunch of contingencies, stuff that we don't know is going to happen here, elsewhere in the world. We're one of those countries where we don't know what the future is going to bring. But of all the radius of possibilities, some of them are pretty hopeful.
Thank you, Jonny. That was a very informative and enlightening conversation. Most grateful. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul. Thank you.